Imagine an older man standing on a moonlit terrace. He is not in Greece. He is in the heart of Asia Minor, at a palace in the Persian city of Magnesia. The air is thick with the scent of roses and exotic spices, not the salt spray of the Aegean. This man is Themistocles. His name once echoed across all of Hellas, hailed as a savior, the living embodiment of the Athenian spirit. Now, he is a satrap, a governor for the Persian king, Xerxes, the son of the very Xerxes whose fleet he crushed in the narrow straits of Salamis. He stares east, toward a Greece he cannot see, his gaze holding the weight of history's sharpest paradox. How? How did the architect of the West's greatest victory over the East end up here, in a golden cage gifted by his enemy? Why did the hero to whom Athens owed its very existence die in service to the Persian throne? To understand this tragedy, we must return to the beginning, to a world on the brink of a fiery cataclysm, where the fates of empires were decided by the will of a few, and where one man's ambition could save the world, or condemn him to eternal exile. His story is not just a biography. It is an exploration of the very nature of power, glory, and betrayal. It is the eternal question of what society does with its heroes once the need for them has passed. He was a genius of strategy, a master of political intrigue, but he could never solve the ultimate riddle: how to manage the envy of gods and men, which always follows a great triumph. And this question, hanging silently in the Persian night, is where our story begins. The world at the dawn of the 5th century BC was a giant chessboard, set for a game where the stakes were nothing less than the future of Western civilization. On one side of this board, occupying nearly all of known space, sprawled the colossal Achaemenid Persian Empire. It was history's first true superpower, a well-oiled bureaucratic machine stretching from the sands of Egypt to the glaciers of the Hindu Kush, from the Aegean coast to the Indus Valley. The empire spoke dozens of languages and worshipped hundreds of gods, but it obeyed a single will, the will of the King of Kings, whose power was considered divine. This Persian might, like a slowly shifting tectonic plate, was moving relentlessly westward, having already absorbed the wealthy Greek cities of Ionia. On the other side of the board, on a small rocky peninsula, huddled a mosaic of hundreds of tiny, independent, and eternally warring city-states who called themselves Hellas. This was a world of chaos, competition, and incredible cultural energy. Sparta was a militaristic oligarchy, a closed society of professional warriors. Corinth, a merchant republic. Thebes, a bastion of landed aristocracy. And among them stood Athens, a city undergoing the most daring and dangerous political experiment in human history. The birth of democracy, the rule of the demos, the common people. This was a fragile, noisy, unpredictable system where fateful decisions were made by the shouts and votes of thousands of citizens on the Nix Hill. It was in this boiling cauldron of political ambition, at the crossroads of two worlds, the despotic order of the East and the anarchic freedom of the West, that a man would emerge whose destiny would mirror the age. A collision was inevitable. It hung in the air like the smell of ozone before a storm. Persia could not tolerate a pocket of defiance on its border, and the Greeks, who valued their freedom above all else, could not accept the idea of submitting to a foreign master. The question was not if there would be a war, but who could lead the resistance, and at what cost. In a world obsessed with noble birth, where lineage defined a man's destiny before he was even born, Themistocles was an outsider from the start. He did not belong to the ancient aristocratic families, like the Alcmaeonids or the Philae, who had ruled Athens for centuries. His father, Neocles, was respectable but not elite, belonging to the class of knights but not the high nobility. The real stigma, however, lay with his mother. Ancient authors, like Plutarch, report she was a foreigner, not an Athenian, perhaps a Thracian named Abrotonon, or a Carian named Euterpe. In Athenian society, where full citizenship was a sacred privilege, being the son of a foreigner meant bearing the mark of inferiority. Such children were called nothoi, bastards or illegitimates, and it closed many doors to them. This origin did not hold him back. It became his most powerful engine. From childhood, he felt the sideways glances of the nobility, felt the glass wall separating him from the chosen circle. It bred in him not an inferiority complex, but a fierce, all-consuming ambition to prove to everyone, and above all, to himself, that he was not just their equal, but their superior. He had to compensate for his lack of nobility with an excess of intelligence, cunning, eloquence, and will. If they relied on the glory of their ancestors, he could rely only on himself. This internal struggle for recognition made his character incredibly flexible and simultaneously ruthless. He learned to speak to the common people, the sailors and craftsmen, in their own language, to understand their needs and fears in a way the haughty aristocrats could not. His impure blood gave him a unique perspective, allowing him to see the weaknesses of Athenian society and use them to his advantage. He was destined to be either a nobody or the greatest of them all. He made his choice long before history gave him the chance. In a world where the will of the gods was as real as the changing of the seasons, any great event was preceded by omens and prophecies, and the fate of Athens, on the eve of the Persian invasion, became inextricably bound to one of the most famous and ambiguous prophecies in history, the oracle at Delphi. When Athenian ambassadors, trembling with fear before Xerxes' approaching armada, arrived at the sanctuary of Apollo in Delphi, they received a terrifying answer. The Pythia, the priestess, foretold their complete and utter destruction. "Flee from your homes and the hills of your city. All is doomed to destruction." The ambassadors were in despair. But then, on the advice of the priests, they approached the oracle a second time. This time, the answer was different, more cryptic. "Only the wooden walls shall Zeus grant to Tritogeneia to be unbreachable to save you and your children." These words threw Athens into chaos. What were the wooden walls? The elders and aristocrats, men of conservative views, were certain it meant the ancient wooden fence that had once surrounded the Acropolis. They called for fortifying the citadel and preparing for a siege, trusting in old traditions. But Themistocles, whose mind always sought novel and unconventional solutions, saw a completely different, revolutionary meaning in the prophecy. He went before the people and declared that the gods were not speaking of a fence, but of ships. The wooden walls were the hulls of the Athenian triremes, the new powerful fleet he himself had convinced them to build just a few years earlier. He argued that Athens' salvation lay not on land, but at sea. This interpretation was daring, almost sacrilegious, as it demanded they abandon the most sacred idea of all, the defense of their native soil and temples. It required them to trust not in stone and wood, but in movement, in maneuver, in the waves. Themistocles managed to convince the volatile assembly of his vision, and this became his first great triumph. He didn't just interpret the will of the gods. He imposed his own vision of the future upon them and upon Athens. This prophecy became his greatest weapon against conservatives and skeptics, a divine mandate for his grand naval strategy that would ultimately save Greece. Themistocles' youth and the forging of his character were inextricably linked to a place that symbolized his social status as an outsider. As the son of a foreigner, he was barred from the prestigious Athenian gymnasia, like the Academy or the Lyceum, where the scions of noble families trained and socialized. His place was the Kynosarges, a gymnasium located outside the city walls, designated for illegitimate citizens, for those very nothoi. The name itself, according to legend, came from the white dog, emphasizing its second-class status. But it was here, in this environment despised by the aristocracy, that the unique character of Hellas's future savior was forged. At Kynosarges, he was among his own kind, ambitious, resentful young men who had to fight their way in life not with nobility, but with talent and persistence. Here, he learned not the aristocratic arts, but the practical skills of survival in a competitive world. He realized that his greatest strength was not physical power, but sharpness of mind and the gift of persuasion. Plutarch tells of how Themistocles would lure boys from noble families to Kynosarges, gradually blurring the line between the pure-blooded and the half-breeds, demonstrating his leadership qualities even as a youth. He spent his days not in idle conversation, but in studying laws, practicing rhetoric, and crafting speeches. He understood a fundamental truth of the new Athenian democracy. Power belonged not to the man with the most glorious ancestors, but to the one who could command the crowd in the popular assembly. Kynosarges was not his place of humiliation, but his school of practical politics. He learned to understand the psychology of the masses, their fears, hopes, and prejudices. He saw how aristocrats, speaking in refined language, failed to reach the heart of common sailors, craftsmen, and farmers. But he could. He was one of them. Yet he possessed a mind capable of grasping the most complex strategic challenges. This experience forever set him apart from the political elite and made him Athens's first great populist leader. The fateful moment that defined not only Themistocles' career, but the future of all Greece came around 483 BC. At Laurion, south of Athens, new, incredibly rich veins of silver ore were discovered. The state treasury was suddenly flooded with unimaginable wealth. By Athenian law, this windfall was to be distributed among all citizens. Each man would receive 10 drachmas, a significant sum for the poor. This was the popular, obvious, and expected decision. The people celebrated in anticipation of easy money. Any politician seeking popularity would have simply supported the handout. But Themistocles was not just any politician. He saw in this silver not a chance for a momentary bribe, but a unique historical chance. He took the assembly platform and made a proposal that seemed insane. He demanded they forego the payout and instead channel the entire sum, a colossal capital of 100 talents, into building a fleet of 200 modern warships, triremes. To convince a public eager for cash required immense persuasion and political cunning. Themistocles didn't try to scare his fellow citizens with the distant and vague Persian threat, which many still didn't believe in. Instead, he used a closer, more familiar enemy, the neighboring island of Aegina, with whom Athens was locked in a long-standing trade war. He framed the fleet as a pressing necessity to defeat their bitter rival. And the demos, led by his fiery speech, did the unthinkable. They chose ships over money. This decision had revolutionary consequences. First, it gave Athens the most powerful fleet in Greece, transforming it into the leading naval power. Second, it created thousands of jobs for the poorest citizens, the Thetes, who became rowers on these triremes and whose political influence surged as a result. Themistocles had, in essence, created his own electorate. This fleet, born from the silver of Laurion and the foresight of one man, became the very wooden walls that would meet Xerxes' armada at Salamis just a few years later. It was his first great strategic masterpiece. Behind all of Themistocles' great deeds, behind his patriotic speeches and brilliant strategic plans, lay one all-consuming, almost demonic force, an unquenchable thirst for glory, or kleos, as the ancient Greeks called it. For a Hellene, kleos was the highest form of immortality, eternal remembrance of one's great deeds in the songs and legends of descendants. And for Themistocles, a man with no noble ancestors, whose name meant nothing to the Athenian aristocracy, achieving this glory became his life's purpose. It was not just ambition, it was an obsession. He wanted his name to stand alongside the heroes of the Trojan War, with Achilles and Odysseus. Plutarch writes that after the Battle of Marathon, where the general Miltiades won great fame, a young Themistocles could not sleep at night. When asked what troubled him, he replied, "The laurels of Miltiades will not let me rest." He didn't envy wealth or power as such. He envied glory. This secret motivation explains many of his actions, both heroic and questionable. It forced him to think on a grand scale, to go beyond ordinary politics, to risk everything for a great cause. It was this thirst for glory that allowed him to see the Persian threat before others and to convince the Athenians to build their fleet. But it also made him intolerant of rivals, arrogant in his dealings, and at times unscrupulous in his methods. He was willing to use deception, manipulation, and political alliances with anyone if it led him to his goal. He understood that the greatest glory could only be won by becoming the savior of his homeland in its darkest hour. And he didn't just wait for this danger. He prepared for it. He craved it, because it was the stage for his triumph. This inner demon of ambition was the source of his incredible energy and foresight, but it also carried the seeds of his future fall. The man who so desperately sought eternal glory in the eyes of his countrymen would, in the end, do everything to make them hate and exile him, failing to understand that greatness and pride are two sides of the same coin. 10 years passed after the glorious Athenian victory at Marathon. 10 years of fragile peace, which Themistocles used to build his fleet. In that time, the Persian Empire had not forgotten its humiliation. King Darius was dead, but his son and heir, Xerxes, inherited both his throne and his thirst for revenge. Xerxes was a different kind of man than his father. He was the embodiment of Eastern despotism, proud, ambitious, and obsessed with the idea of conquering the world. He decided to correct his father's mistake and gather forces unseen in human history. Preparations for the invasion of Greece were carried out for several years on an unimaginable scale. Troops were gathered from across the vast empire, from Ethiopia to Bactria. Herodotus, though prone to exaggeration, paints an apocalyptic picture, an army of over 5 million people, including soldiers and support staff, and a fleet of over 1,200 warships. Even if these numbers are divided by 5 or 10, they remain staggering. To move this mass of people across the Hellespont, Persian engineers built a massive pontoon bridge. To avoid the storms at Mount Athos that had once wrecked a Persian fleet, Xerxes ordered a canal dug straight through the peninsula, a titanic labor designed to show that the king could conquer not only men, but nature itself. This armada was not just an army, it was an entire world in motion, an avalanche rolling toward tiny Hellas. News of this invasion chilled the blood of the Greeks. Many cities in northern Greece, seeing this unstoppable force, submitted without a fight, sending the Persian king earth and water as a sign of submission. It seemed resistance was futile. The fate of Hellas hung by a thread, and only a miracle or the genius of a madman could save it from total annihilation. And that mad genius was destined to be Themistocles. Facing the approaching catastrophe, the Greek city-states, setting aside their eternal quarrels for a moment, gathered an all-Greek congress at the Isthmus of Corinth. It was decided to make a stand on land at the pass of Thermopylae and at sea near Cape Artemisium. But Themistocles knew these measures were not enough. He knew that once the Persians passed Thermopylae, they would inevitably reach Attica. And so, he proposed something to the Athenian assembly that was unthinkable, something that went against every Greek notion of honor, religion, and patriotism. He proposed to completely abandon Athens, to evacuate the entire civilian population, women, children, and the elderly, to the nearby island of Salamis and the city of Troezen, and to put every able-bodied man onto the ships. In effect, he declared a revolutionary thesis. Our Athens is not the land and the walls, it is our people and our fleet. This decision caused an uproar. Abandon the sacred Acropolis, the temples of the patron gods, the tombs of their ancestors, to desecration by the enemy? For many, this was sacrilege, an act of betrayal. The aristocrats and landowners, whose wealth was tied to the land of Attica, resisted furiously. They accused Themistocles of madness. But he was relentless. Using all his eloquence, citing the oracle of the wooden walls, he managed to convince the majority. The tragic and majestic exodus began. An entire people left their city, leaving it empty and defenseless. The weeping of women, the cries of children, the barking of dogs, all of it mixed in an air thick with despair and uncertainty. This act of collective sacrifice was unprecedented, but it was the strategic key to victory. Themistocles deprived Xerxes of his primary target. There would be no one to conquer in Athens. He was turning a war for territory into a war of attrition at sea, where the Greeks had a chance. He gave the enemy the city in order to, in the end, save all of Greece. It was the move of a genius, capable of thinking in categories beyond the reach of his contemporaries. The first serious test for the new Greek fleet and for Themistocles' strategy was the naval battle at Cape Artemisium, which took place at the same time as King Leonidas's heroic defense at Thermopylae. The combined Greek fleet, numbering about 270 triremes, took up a position in the narrow strait between the island of Euboea and the mainland. Command was formerly held by the Spartan, Eurybiades, but the de facto leader, the soul and brain of the operation, was Themistocles, who commanded the largest squadron, the Athenian one. Here, in these waters, the bloody rehearsal for Salamis was to take place. The Persian fleet, outnumbering the Greeks at least 2-1, attempted to outflank them by sending 200 ships around Euboea. But the gods, it seemed, were on the Hellenic side. A terrible storm fell on the Persian squadron and completely destroyed it. This was taken as a good omen. For 3 days, fierce battles raged in the strait. Themistocles displayed all his tactical genius here. He used his knowledge of local conditions, attacking in the evening when darkness prevented the Persians from using their numerical advantage, and employed cunning maneuvers. The Greeks fought with desperate courage, inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. Although neither side won a decisive victory, the Battle of Artemisium was psychologically crucial. The Greek sailors, many of in their first battle, realized they could fight the Persians on equal terms. They saw that their heavier, sturdier triremes had an advantage in close-quarters combat over the lighter, faster Phoenician and Ionian vessels. Themistocles gained priceless intelligence on the enemy's tactics. However, when news arrived of the fall of Thermopylae and the death of Leonidas, holding the position at Artemisium no longer made sense. The land route to central Greece was open. The Greek fleet conducted an organized retreat south, toward Salamis, carrying with them the bitter taste of loss, but also a newfound confidence in their strength and in the genius of their Athenian leader. The decisive battle was still to come. The retreat from Artemisium and the terrible news that Athens had been burned by the Persians threw the Greek allies into a state of near panic. The combined fleet gathered in the narrow strait by the island of Salamis, where refugees from all over Attica were streaming. And at this critical moment, Hellenic unity, already fragile, began to crack. The fleet commander, the Spartan Eurybiades, was a brave man, but indecisive and lacking strategic vision. Most of the Peloponnesian contingents, from Corinth, Sicyon, and Megara, demanded the fleet immediately withdraw to the Isthmus of Corinth. Their logic was simple and selfish. Their cities were behind the isthmus, where the Spartans were already building a defensive wall. They wanted to fight on their own doorstep, defending their own families and lands, and cared nothing for the hundreds of thousands of Athenian refugees sheltered on Salamis. Themistocles understood with horror that this plan was suicide. To retreat to the isthmus meant sailing into the open waters of the Saronic Gulf, where the massive Persian fleet could easily surround and annihilate them, using its numerical advantage. Only here, in the narrow straits of Salamis, where the maneuver of large squadrons was difficult, did the Greeks have a chance to neutralize the enemy's numbers. He confronted Eurybiades and the other commanders with the full force of his eloquence. The famous phrase he hurled at Eurybiades when the Spartan threatened to strike him with his staff was, "Strike, but listen." He begged, he threatened, he bribed. He declared that if the fleet abandoned Salamis, the Athenians, who made up more than half of the entire force, would take their families, sail away, and found a new city in Italy, leaving the rest of Greece to its fate. This ultimatum worked, but only temporarily. The allies wavered, ready at any moment to raise anchor and leave. Themistocles realized persuasion was not enough. He needed a move that would make the battle at Salamis not just desirable, but inevitable. And so he resolved to take the most brilliant and dangerous gamble of his life. Seeing the war council mired in endless indecisive debate, and with the Peloponnesian commanders about to lead their ships away, Themistocles knew he had one last, desperate chance. He had to force the enemy to do what he could not convince his allies to do. He had to provoke Xerxes into an immediate attack, under conditions unfavorable to the Persians. Late at night, he summoned his most trusted servant, a eunuch named Xerxes, who was his children's tutor and spoke Persian fluently. He entrusted him with a mission upon which the fate of Greece depended. Xerxes crossed the strait in a small boat under cover of darkness and, posing as a deserter, demanded to be taken to the king. Once before Xerxes, he delivered a secret message from Themistocles. The content of this message was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Xerxes told the king that his master, the Athenian general, secretly wished for a Persian victory and was therefore informing him that the Greeks were gripped by panic and planning to flee the Salamis Strait that very night. Themistocles advised Xerxes not to miss this unique chance, to immediately block both exits of the strait and attack the demoralized and fractured Greek fleet at dawn, to destroy it in a single blow. This message was designed to play on Xerxes' two great character flaws, his arrogance and his impatience. The king already saw himself as the victor. He had burned Athens, and the thought of his prey slipping through his fingers was unbearable. He believed the lie because it was exactly what he wanted to hear. This secret gambit by Themistocles was incredibly risky. If Xerxes had suspected a trick, or if the Greeks had actually fled before the battle, all would have been lost. But Themistocles staked everything, having perfectly calculated his enemy's psychology. He had turned the weakness of the Greek alliance into his greatest strength. Xerxes, blinded by hubris and believing the false report, immediately gave the order. The trap set by Themistocles snapped shut. The Persian fleet was commanded to move out and completely blockade the Salamis Strait. The best squadron, 200 Egyptian ships, was sent around the island of Salamis to lock down the western, narrower exit of the strait, through which Xerxes believed the Greeks would try to flee. The main force, hundreds of Phoenician, Ionian, Cypriot, and Cilician ships, began to enter the eastern main strait, forming up in several lines and cutting off any path of retreat. All night, the Persian sailors remained at their oars, performing this complex and exhausting maneuver in full battle readiness, while the Greek crews rested on shore, gathering their strength for the decisive battle. Meanwhile, on the Greek side, there was complete ignorance. The arguments continued. But then, an event occurred that put an end to them. Aristides, Themistocles' bitter political rival, who had previously been ostracized but had returned to serve his homeland, managed to slip through the Persian lines in his ship. He arrived at the council and informed the stunned commanders that they were completely surrounded. There was no escape. They now had only one choice: fight and win, or die. The irony was that Themistocles' greatest enemy had just confirmed the brilliance of his plan. Now, even the most hesitant commanders understood that battle was inevitable. The night before, the battle was filled with tense anticipation. Xerxes, confident of success, ordered his golden throne to be set up on the slopes of Mount Aegaleus, on the mainland shore, to personally observe the destruction of the Hellenes and to record the names of his most distinguished commanders. He prepared to be the spectator of his greatest triumph, never suspecting he was about to witness his greatest disaster. With the first light of dawn on September 28th, 430 BC, a terrifying sight met the Greek sailors as they looked out from behind the rocky headlands of Salamis. The entire strait was choked with enemy ships. There were so many, it seemed there was no open water left. Hundreds of colorful sails, the glint of bronze armor, a forest of masts. It all created an impression of invincible power. On the shore, on the mountainside, the golden throne of Xerxes glittered in the sun, surrounded by his immortal guard. The psychological pressure was colossal. But at that moment, as Aeschylus, a participant in the battle, wrote, a mighty unified sound rose from the Greek camp. It was the battle hymn, the paean, addressed to the gods. On, sons of the Greeks! Free your homeland, free your children, your wives, the temples of your fathers' gods, the tombs of your ancestors. Now the fight is for everything. And following this hymn, the Greek triremes surged from the bays and coves like a swarm of angry wasps. Themistocles had arranged his fleet so that its left flank was covered by the shore of Salamis. He deliberately began the battle with a feigned retreat, luring the vanguard of the Persian fleet, composed of elite Phoenician ships, deeper into the narrows. The Persians, confident of an easy victory, rushed forward, breaking their formation. And at that moment, the Greeks struck a devastating blow. The Athenian triremes, heavier and armed with powerful bronze rams, smashed into the hulls of the enemy ships. A brutal melee began. The narrow strait, which was supposed to be the grave of the Greek fleet, became a death trap for the Persian one. Ships collided, broke oars, and tangled with one another. The second and third lines of the Persian fleet, pressing from behind, only added to the chaos, preventing the frontline ships from maneuvering or retreating. The dawn that had promised Xerxes a triumph was now stained with the colors of blood and smoke. The Battle of Salamis dissolved into a gigantic, chaotic brawl, where the individual skill of the crews and the sturdiness of the ships mattered more than initial tactical formations. And here, Themistocles' strategy worked perfectly. The Greek hoplites fighting on the decks were far better protected and prepared for boarding actions than the Persian archers and infantry. Each Greek trireme became a floating fortress, ramming and boarding enemy vessels. The Athenians on the left flank crushed the elite Phoenician ships. Aristobulus, Xerxes' brother and the Persian fleet commander, was killed early in the battle, sowing confusion in the attackers' ranks. On the right flank, the Aegian ships, famed for their speed, executed a daring maneuver and attacked the Persians from the flank, completing the rout. Artemisia, the queen of Halicarnassus, fighting for the Persians, particularly distinguished herself. Pursued by an Athenian ship, she coolly rammed and sank one of her own allied ships, creating the illusion that she was on the Greek side, and thus escaped. Xerxes, watching from his throne and not understanding the situation, famously remarked, "My men have become women, and my women men." But this single episode could not change the disaster. The Persian fleet was shattered. Ships, trying to flee, collided with each other and ran aground. The strait was filled with wreckage, bodies of men and horses. Aristides, with his detachment of hoplites, landed on the island of Citylea and slaughtered the entire Persian garrison. By evening, it was over. All that remained of Xerxes' great armada was a pathetic fraction. The victory was total and unconditional. It was a triumph not just of arms, but of will, cunning, and the strategic genius of one man who had managed to turn despair into hope and weakness into strength. Greece was saved. After Salamis, the name Themistocles was synonymous with victory. All of Hellas, from Sparta to the most distant islands, celebrated him as their savior. If the Battle of Marathon was the triumph of the Athenian hoplites, Salamis was the triumph of the Athenian fleet, and therefore the triumph of Themistocles. He had reached the peak of glory he had craved for so long. His Kleos was assured for centuries. Immediately after the battle, the Greek generals gathered at the Isthmus of Corinth to award prizes for valor. According to tradition, each general voted for himself for first place, but nearly every single one named Themistocles for second. This silent admission of his decisive role was more eloquent than any praise. But the true measure of his status was his visit to Sparta. Sparta, Athens' eternal rival and competitor, a place that distrusted foreigners and despised democratic chaos, gave him honors never before bestowed on a non-Spartan. They crowned him with the olive wreath, traditionally reserved for Olympic victors, and gifted him the finest chariot. 300 elite Spartan warriors, the flower of their army, escorted him all the way to the border. All of Greece saw him not just as an Athenian general, but as a pan-Hellenic hero. When he appeared at the next Olympic Games, the crowd reportedly stopped watching the athletes and spent the entire day staring at him, pointing him out in admiration. Themistocles reveled in this glory. He was on top of the world. He had achieved everything the boy from Kynosarges could have dreamed of. He had saved his people, humiliated the world's greatest empire, and written his name into history. But it was at this dizzying height, in the rays of universal adoration, that he began to be stalked by his most dangerous enemy, his own pride. His hubris, which the Greeks believed always invites the wrath of the gods and the envy of men. Drunk on victory and universal adoration, Themistocles' character began to sour. The man who had always been a master of hidden intrigues and subtle manipulations now began to act with open arrogance and defiance. He stopped being the first among equals, as a leader in a democracy should be, and began to behave like a monarch or even a deity. In his speeches, he increasingly attributed the victory solely to his own foresight and genius, diminishing the role of the allies and even implying the gods should be grateful to him. He built a shrine near his home to Artemis Aristoboule, Artemis of best counsel, a clear and unambiguous hint as to whose counsel had been best for Greece. This was seen as an act of outrageous pride, a challenge to the gods and traditional values. Furthermore, his thirst for glory was now joined by a thirst for profit. While commanding the fleet after Salamis, he began to openly extort money from Greek islands that had sympathized with the Persians or had failed to provide sufficient aid. He would sail to their cities and, under threat of force, demand huge sums of money, a significant portion of which, it was rumored, he pocketed himself. Plutarch tells the story of how the people of Andros refused to pay, claiming they had two powerful gods, poverty and impossibility. Themistocles retorted that the Athenians had two even more powerful gods, persuasion and compulsion. This behavior shocked the Greeks. The man who had just been their savior was transforming, before their very eyes, into a tyrant and an extortionist. These actions sowed the seeds of hatred and envy. The aristocracy, which already disliked him, now had powerful weapons to discredit him. The common people who had worshipped him began to see him not as their leader, but as an arrogant plutocrat who scorned the law. Themistocles' hubris was becoming his Achilles' heel. He had won the war with Persia, but now he was starting a war with his own countrymen, a war he was not destined to win. After the Persians were finally expelled from Greece, the main task for the Athenians was rebuilding their burned city. Here again, Themistocles showed his strategic foresight and his complete disregard for the opinions of his allies, especially Sparta. He understood that the guarantee of Athens' future security and independence was not just the courage of its hoplites, but the strength of its fortifications. He proposed not just rebuilding the old walls, but enclosing both Athens and its port, Piraeus, with massive new fortifications, and then connecting the city and port with the so-called long walls, creating a single, unified fortress, virtually invulnerable from land and always supplied from the sea. This project would turn Athens into an impregnable maritime fortress and establish its dominance in the Aegean. Sparta, watching Athens' growing power with alarm, was furious. Spartan envoys arrived in Athens and demanded they immediately stop construction. Their formal pretext was plausible. They argued that if the Persians invaded again and captured a fortified Athens, they would gain a powerful base of operations. But the true reason was fear of Athenian domination. Themistocles once again resorted to his favorite tactic, deception and trickery. He advised the Athenians to send the Spartan envoys home, promising that an Athenian embassy, led by him, would soon arrive in Sparta for negotiations. He then traveled to Sparta himself, but deliberately delayed his journey and the start of talks, claiming he was waiting for his colleagues. Meanwhile, he sent a secret order back to Athens: work day and night. Use everyone, men, women, and children, and spare nothing, neither private homes nor temples, for building material, to get the walls to a minimum defensible height as quickly as possible. When the Spartans, growing suspicious, confronted him with direct accusations, he denied everything and suggested they send their own envoys to Athens to see for themselves, while holding his colleagues in Sparta as hostages. By the time the trick was exposed, the walls were already high enough to be defended. Themistocles triumphantly announced to the Spartans that Athens was now capable of deciding for itself what was best for it and for all of Hellas. It was a slap in the face to Spartan hegemony, one they would never forgive. Themistocles' success, his growing influence, and his defiant behavior inevitably created a powerful opposition. And it was not long in coming. In Athenian society, where the aristocracy still held immense authority and wealth, a strong anti-Themistocles bloc began to form. At the head of this bloc stood Cimon, the son of Miltiades, the hero of Marathon. Cimon was Themistocles' polar opposite. He was noble, rich, handsome, generous, and had a flawless reputation. If Themistocles represented the new naval democracy, relying on the poor rowers, Cimon was the leader of the conservative, aristocratic, and land-owning circles. He favored an alliance with Sparta and traditional values, whereas Themistocles saw Athens' future in maritime expansion and opposition to Sparta. A bitter political struggle began, in which every tool was used against Themistocles. His opponents systematically worked to create a negative image of him in the eyes of the demos. They accused him of impiety for his arrogant statements, of tyrannical ambitions for his domineering style of leadership, and of amassing a fantastic fortune through extortion. Every move he made was examined under a microscope and interpreted in the worst possible light. The Athenian people, who had once adored him, began to grow tired of their hero. Democracy, like a fickle god, demanded new idols. Themistocles' greatness began to frighten the Athenians. They feared that a man with such glory and influence could easily seize absolute power and become a tyrant, destroying the freedom they had fought so hard to win. Cimon and his supporters skillfully played on these fears. They portrayed Themistocles as a threat to the democratic order, a man who had placed himself above the laws and the city-state. The clouds above the savior of Hellas were darkening. His greatest virtues, his ambition, his genius, his ability to go against the grain, were now presented as his greatest vices. The groundwork for his exile was being meticulously laid. Athenian democracy possessed a unique and fearsome tool for dealing with overly influential politicians: ostracism. Once a year, the popular assembly could decide to hold a special vote. Each citizen wishing to participate would write on a shard of pottery, an ostracon, the name of the man he considered most dangerous to the state. If at least 6,000 people voted, the man whose name appeared most often was exiled from Athens for 10 years, without trial or confiscation of property. This was not a punishment for a crime, but a political precaution, a way to release steam and get rid of a figure who had become too powerful and might threaten democratic equality. And around 471 BC, this formidable mechanism was turned on Themistocles. His enemies, led by Cimon, ran a powerful campaign, and on the appointed day, thousands of Athenians came to the agora to cast their vote. Archaeologists have found these ostraca, and many of them bear the scratched name Themistocles, son of Neocles. There is a famous anecdote told by Plutarch. On the day of the vote, an illiterate farmer who did not know Themistocles by sight approached him and asked him to write a name on his ostracon, Themistocles. When the astonished politician asked what harm Themistocles had ever done him, the farmer replied, "None. I don't even know him. But I'm tired of hearing him called the Just everywhere." This story, perhaps fictional, perfectly captures the psychology of the crowd. The Athenians were tired of their hero. They exiled him not for a specific crime, but because he was too great, too famous, too successful. His exile was the ultimate expression of the very democracy he had so zealously defended and used. He was brought down by the very people he had saved. The verdict of the pottery shards was final and irreversible. The savior of Greece was forced to leave his native city and go into humiliating exile. After leaving Athens, Themistocles initially settled in Argos, a city in the Peloponnese that was a traditional rival of Sparta. Here, he lived the life of an honored exile, still wielding considerable influence in the Greek world. But his enemies in Athens, and especially in Sparta, would not leave him in peace. They saw him as a constant threat, a man capable of weaving intrigues and building anti-Spartan coalitions. And soon, they found the perfect opportunity to destroy him completely. Around this time, the conspiracy of Pausanias, the regent and victor of the Battle of Plataea, was uncovered in Sparta. Pausanias, much like Themistocles, had become drunk on his own glory and had entered into secret negotiations with the Persian king, promising to conquer all of Greece for him in exchange for his daughter's hand and power. The plot was exposed, and Pausanias was executed. The Spartans, who hated Themistocles, decided to use this story. They claimed to have found correspondence proving that Themistocles was Pausanias' accomplice and had participated in his treasonous plot. The evidence was almost certainly fabricated, but that didn't matter to Themistocles' enemies. They officially charged him with the worst crime imaginable for a Greek, medism, or conspiring with the Persians. The irony was savage and cynical. The man who had done more than any other to defeat Persia was now accused of betraying Greece to Persia. The Athenian assembly, now completely under Timon's influence, supported the Spartan charges. Themistocles was tried in absentia and sentenced to death. His property in Athens was confiscated. He was no longer just an exile. He was a state criminal, a fugitive, an outlaw. Messengers were sent throughout Greece with orders to capture him and deliver him for execution. A manhunt began for the man who had once been the greatest hero of Hellas. The death sentence turned Themistocles' life into a desperate, unending flight. He could no longer stay in Argos. He was forced to wander throughout Greece like a hunted animal, seeking refuge and finding only temporary shelter. He fled to the island of Corcyra, which owed its prosperity to him, but even they refused him protection, fearing the wrath of Athens and Sparta. From there he fled to Epirus, to the court of King Admetus. Admetus had once been his political enemy, but Themistocles, knowing the ancient laws of sanctuary, made a desperate gesture. He entered the palace, took the king's young son in his arms, and sat by the hearth, a sacred spot that made a supplicant untouchable. Admetus, moved by the gesture and respecting the ancient custom, did not betray him to his pursuers and helped him travel secretly onward. His path led him across Macedonia and into Asia Minor, into territory controlled by his mortal enemy, the Persian Empire. Every step of his journey was fraught with mortal peril. He hid, changed his name, and relied on the help of the few friends who remained loyal. This period of his life was filled with humiliation and despair. The man who had commanded fleets and decided the fates of nations now depended on the mercy of petty kings and risked capture at any moment. He saw former allies turn their backs on him, heard his name cursed in the city he had saved. It was a fall from the greatest height into the deepest abyss. And it was at this moment, when it seemed there was no way out, when the entire Greek world had turned against him, that his desperate and adventurous mind produced the most unthinkable and paradoxical plan imaginable. If Greece rejected him, if it craved his death, then he would go to the one place they would never expect. He would go to the source of all his glory and all his sorrow. He would go to the great king. Hunted, betrayed, and cursed in his homeland, Themistocles made his final and most desperate leap into the unknown. He decided to seek refuge in the heart of the very empire he had once brought to its knees. It was a move of staggering audacity and sheer desperation. It was akin to a wolf seeking safety in the den of a lion he had once wounded. He knew his appearance at the Persian court could mean immediate, agonizing execution. His name was hated by the Persians. He was the cause of their greatest humiliation, the man responsible for the deaths of thousands of their countrymen, including members of the royal family. But Themistocles had no choice. He secretly arrived in Susa, the imperial capital, where Artaxerxes, Xerxes' young son, now ruled. Getting into the palace was not easy, but with the help of a courtier, he managed it. The scene of his meeting with Artaxerxes, as described by ancient historians, is filled with incredible drama. Themistocles, according to Persian custom, performed proskynesis, prostrating himself before the king. When allowed to speak, he did not hide his name. "I, Themistocles, have come to you," he said. "I who brought more harm to your house than any other Hellene, so long as I was forced to defend myself against your father. But I also brought him the most good, when I advised him to retreat from Salamis and not destroy the bridges at the Hellespont. Now, hunted by all of Greece, I come to you for refuge. My life is in your hands. If you save me, you gain a faithful servant. If you kill me, you destroy an enemy of your house." This speech was a psychological masterpiece. He simultaneously admitted his guilt, reminded the king of his power, and offered his services. He presented Artaxerxes with a choice: act on petty vengeance, or behave like a wise and far-sighted ruler who could use the talents of his greatest enemy for his own benefit. Artaxerxes was stunned. Before him knelt the legend, the demon whose name frightened Persian children, the architect of the disaster at Salamis. The king could have ordered his execution on the spot, and all of Persia would have applauded the act of retribution. But the young monarch proved wiser and more far-sighted than expected. He saw in Themistocles' offer not audacity, but a unique opportunity. Who knew the strengths and weaknesses of the Greek world better than this man? Who could be a more valuable advisor in future dealings with the Hellenes? And to show magnanimity to one's greatest foe would be a powerful propaganda move, demonstrating the mercy and grandeur of the Persian king. After some thought, Artaxerxes made a decision that shocked his court. He not only spared Themistocles, but showered him with honors. Plutarch says that the king woke up 3 times that night, shouting, "I have Themistocles the Athenian." This shows what a great prize he considered his new guest. Themistocles was given an immense pension and granted the revenues of 3 rich cities in Asia Minor: Magnesia for his bread, Lampsacus for his wine, and Myus for his other delicacies. In effect, he became a Persian satrap, a wealthy and influential nobleman. He, who had spent his life fighting for the freedom of the Greek polis, was now part of the despotic administrative machinery of the Persian Empire. He lived in a luxurious palace, surrounded by servants and honor. But it was a golden cage. He had gained safety and wealth, but the price was high. He had forever lost his homeland and become the servant of his enemy. The paradox of his destiny was complete. The years Themistocles spent in Persia were filled with the deepest irony. The man who was the embodiment of the Athenian spirit, enterprising, freedom-loving, and defiant, now lived the life of an Eastern potentate. He diligently studied the Persian language and laws, mastering court etiquette to be useful to his new lord. He wore Persian robes, ate at the king's table, and likely gave Artaxerxes advice on Greek affairs. In Magnesia, they even minted coins with his image, an unheard-of honor for a living man in the Greek world, but common practice for Eastern rulers. He lived in a luxury he could never have dreamed of in democratic Athens. His table was laden with delicacies, his palaces full of servants. He was safe. His enemies could not reach him. But at what cost was this safety bought? Could he be happy, knowing that every piece of bread he ate was grown on his enemy's land, and the wine he drank was a gift from the son of the man whose empire he had nearly destroyed? Every day was a reminder of his fall. He, the savior of Hellenic freedom, was now a symbol of its opposite: voluntary submission to a barbarian king. The Greeks, hearing of his fate, were divided. Some cursed him as the ultimate traitor, sold out for Persian gold. Others, perhaps, pitied him, understanding that it was the injustice of his own countrymen that had pushed him into the arms of the enemy. Themistocles himself likely felt a complex mix of relief at his salvation, humiliation at his position, and perhaps a secret hope of one day returning, or at least of avenging himself on his accusers. He was a living monument to the ultimate paradox, a hero forced to become a servant, a savior who accepted mercy from those he had defeated. Years passed. Themistocles lived in his honorable exile, while relations between Athens and Persia remained tense. And then, a moment came when his debt to the Persian king would face its final, terrible test. A massive anti-Persian revolt erupted in Egypt, one of the wealthiest satrapies of the Persian Empire. Athens, seeing a chance to weaken its old enemy, sent its fleet to help the rebels. For Artaxerxes, this was a serious challenge. And so, according to one of the most dramatic versions of his biography, passed down by Plutarch, the king summoned Themistocles. He reminded him of his oath of loyalty and of the mercies he had been shown. Now, it was time to pay his debt. Artaxerxes offered Themistocles command of the Persian fleet and army in a new war against Greece, and specifically against Athens. For Themistocles, this was an unthinkable, monstrous choice. His entire life, all his glory, was built on defending Hellas from the Persians. And now, he was being asked to lead those same Persians against his homeland, against the city that, despite all its injustice, he still loved. On one side of the scale was his oath to the Persian king, his life, and the safety of his family, who lived with him in Magnesia. On the other was his past, his honor, his name, which, if he agreed, would be forever cursed in history. He could refuse, but that would mean breaking his word to the monarch who had saved his life, and would almost certainly doom him and his loved ones to death. He could accept and gain the chance to take revenge on his enemies in Athens, returning at the head of an enemy army. He was trapped in a tragic situation with no good exit, a snare set by fate itself. Facing this impossible choice, the end of Themistocles' life is shrouded in legends that only emphasize the greatness of his tragedy. The most famous and heroic version of events is reported by Plutarch, citing the historian Thucydides. According to this version, Themistocles realized he could neither break his oath to Artaxerxes nor raise arms against his homeland. He gathered his friends, held a final feast, made sacrifices to the gods, and then committed suicide. The method he chose was symbolic and terrible. He drank a cup of fresh bull's blood, which was believed in antiquity to be a fatal poison that caused suffocation. This act was his final refusal, a refusal to choose between treason and ingratitude. He chose death over dishonor. This version is certainly the most cinematic, and it allows Themistocles to die as a tragic hero, preserving the last shreds of his honor. However, other more prosaic sources report he died of a sudden illness. Perhaps the legend of suicide was created later by his friends or family, to whitewash his name and cast his final act as one of patriotism. But regardless of the true cause of his death, its symbolic meaning is immense. His life ended far from Athens, in Persian lands, in the service of the enemy. His grave, according to some accounts, was secretly moved to Attica by his relatives, as a traitor could not be openly buried on his native soil. Thus ended the journey of the man who rose to unbelievable heights and was cast into the abyss. His death, like his life, became the embodiment of the paradox. He died because he was too much of a Greek to betray Athens, yet he was in a position where he had to, because Athens had betrayed him first. So why did the savior of Greece die in the service of the Persian king? Having followed his entire path, we can now answer this central question. The paradox of his fate is not the result of a single bad decision or one act of betrayal. It is the inevitable result of a titanic personality colliding with the very system he created and saved. Themistocles was not destroyed by the Persians, nor by the Spartans, nor even by his political enemies. Themistocles was destroyed by Athens and by Athenian democracy. The very qualities that made him indispensable in the hour of mortal danger, his brilliant foresight, his cunning, his boundless ambition, became unbearable to society in times of peace. His brilliant foresight was seen by his fellow citizens as dangerous ambition. His cunning and willingness to deceive, which he had used against Xerxes, were now seen as a lack of principle. His immense ambition, the engine of victory, began to frighten Athenians, who feared the rise of a new tyrant. He was a product of democracy, an upstart without noble roots who rose to the top through his talent for persuading the people. And he became its victim. When those same people, driven by fear and envy, which were skillfully stoked by his aristocratic opponents, turned against him. He was like a brilliant surgeon who had performed a complex, life-saving operation, but whose rough manners and bloody hands became repulsive after the operation was over. Athens used him to survive, and then cast him aside, like a broken tool that was no longer needed and was a reminder of terrible times. His exile and subsequent flight to Persia were not the cause of his tragedy, but merely its final act. The cause was the unsolvable conflict between genius and society, between the hero and the crowd. He saved democracy from an external enemy, but he could not save himself from its internal demons: envy, fear, and inconstancy. The story of Themistocles is more than just one man's biography. It is a timeless, universal lesson about the nature of power, glory, and human ingratitude, one that remains relevant to this day. His life is the archetypal drama of how society treats its saviors. In a time of crisis, it seeks out and celebrates extraordinary individuals, people who are bold, daring, and willing to break the rules for the greater good. But as soon as the crisis has passed, those same qualities begin to inspire irritation and fear. The leader who was indispensable in the storm seems too large and dangerous for the calm harbor. The legacy of Themistocles is dual and paradoxical, like his entire life. For historians, he is an undeniable genius, the man whose naval strategy defined Athens' future as a great maritime power, created the conditions for the golden age of Pericles, and perhaps saved the very concept of Western freedom from being absorbed by Eastern despotism. Without his fleet and his cunning at Salamis, world history might have taken a completely different path. But for moralists, his story is a warning about the dangers of hubris, of excessive pride, which inevitably leads to a fall. He showed how thin the line is between hero and traitor, and how easily public opinion can turn one into the other. His fate forces us to ask, what is more important? Loyalty to an ungrateful homeland, or one's own survival? Is he a traitor for accepting the enemy's mercy, or a victim of his own people's betrayal? There is no simple answer, and in that ambiguity lies the greatness of his tragedy. Themistocles remains an eternal reminder that the path to glory is often paved with ingratitude, and the price for saving the world is, sometimes, eternal exile.